Also, other obstacles in access to justice are non-effective preventive and protection orders, lack of judicial offices in rural, poor, and marginal areas, lack of free legal aid for victims. And remember that if we need to pay for legal assistance, who are the poorest people in the world? Women. So they're the ones who are going to have most trouble in hiring a lawyer to represent them in court. The lack of legal literacy, important investigation weaknesses in the police and the prosecutor's office, lack of gender competence of capacity to address gender violence, that is among all of the sectors, the police, the prosecutors, the judiciary, inadequate service provision, lack of gender balance in the police and the judiciary, lack of economic resources provided to women seeking justice. Now, let's talk a little bit about the response. How to address these gender inequalities that we've spoken about in access to justice? Well, I'd like to share with you some of the guidelines that should be taken in account when designing programs, projects, and actions. First of all, they should be, like I said before, they should be interinstitutional. We should have the coordination of tables. This program that we have for sexual assault victims, we put together 11 different institutions from the executive branch and from the judicial branch in our country. We brought in the health system. So it's fundamental to have an interinstitutional focus. Also intersectorial view, and this view is born in Latin America by the feminist movements in Latin America. Because, and I have to say, the European and North American feminist movements in the decades of 70s and 80s, they fell in the trampa, in the trap of the patriarchal system, and set their view specifically on one type of woman, which was the white woman with a middle or high economical level, not rural, and of a certain age. So from the Latin American feminist movements, we started to see other women. We started to set our view in the problems of other groups of women, indigenous women, Afro-American women, women with disabilities, elder women, girls, women in poverty. All of these groups that are our reality in Latin America and are the reality of most of the world, because Europe is the exception to the rule. And that is really painful to the heart, but it's the exception. Most of the countries don't have that. In most, when you summarize the numbers of the population of countries where women's rights don't even exist practically, that's the majority. So it's we had to come up with a view to see and visualize these other women that are the ones that mostly need the advance in human rights. It has to be sustainable throughout the process. It has to be integrated within the overall government public policy, and it has to have a based on human rights instrument as the framework, and that is going to give you the power to, Benedetta talks about, and Marina, to suggest to the countries. That I am from government, I talk about make them comply. It's mandatory. They have to do it. They cannot deny themselves. They took the commitment internationally with CEDAW and other instruments. They just have to do it, and period. And anyway, they need the money. So you have the power to convince them. You have to have a strong political and technical components. That's the way it works. At the political level, but also very strong technical level in order for them to make a quick advance. You must ask for sex disaggregated data. But not only sex disaggregated data. In order to be able to apply this intersectorial principle, you need to have other gender-sensitive variables in statistics. And for that, we need to know nationality. We need to know whether they're migrants or refugees. We need to know if they have disabilities. We need to know what their age is. We need to know if they're children, teenagers, elderly women. We need to know if they're indigenous. We need to know if they belong to ethnics that are being discriminated. And to do that, we must create the software, the informatic systems, and the statistical systems to gather all this data. Because we will never know what are the programs that these women need if we don't even know where they are, who they are, and when they're coming to our system. And that is basic. So it's not only sex disaggregated, it's all of these social demographic statistical data that we need to gather. And I can tell you by the work we are doing in the Ibero-American Judicial Summit that there is not a single country in Latin America that has a judicial system that disaggregates data, not even at the sex level, which is the most basic one. Maybe only the criminal systems do, and regarding the person that is being prosecuted. That's it. They don't even have sex disaggregated data when it comes to victims. So that is something that has to be worked. We are working on it from this summit, and we are about to sign agreement with UN Women in order to take what Costa Rica is doing to the rest of the countries of Ibero-America, which are 23. How to address gender inequalities in access to justice? Well, also ensure that women's needs and priorities are voiced. Understand and address at every state of the justice chain, and that means that we have to work, the terms of reference have to enclose the methodologies for the consultants to work with focal groups. We have to include the voice of women. It's not what we think they need. We need to know what they are saying in order to really know what they need. Work to address discriminatory laws and women's obstacles to access to justice. Avoid reinforcing gender inequalities by ignoring existing unequal gender relations and power disparities between women and men. And it's very frequent in my institution to hear young women and men, maybe 25 to 30 years of age, professionals from urban areas saying, in Costa Rica, there's no longer a gender gap. This doesn't exist. So the first thing that we do when we train them is for them to open their eyes and see what's out there beyond their bubble where they live, because they also are the exception in the country. And absolutely, we need to engage men, and that is for me, it's going to be the next revolution in girls' and women's human rights, when the other 50% of the population comes in hand with us in order to fight for women's and girls' rights, because that is going to build a more democratic society. And United Nations has taken this step, and we can see it with the He for She campaign that all of our institutions should be working on. Well, I only have 5 minutes left, so let's see how we can rush. Some ideas in the justice sectors. Okay, thank you. Well, I did take 3 planes to get here in 24 hours, so that will be a medida especial de carácter temporal, an affirmative action for me, okay, for the Costa Rican here. Thank you. Okay, so when it comes to the justice sector, I advise you to implement programs and policies focusing on 2 main levels. One internal level that's going to see the vision of the institution itself. And there we are going to work with the planification department budget department, human resources, training units, auditing department, statistic departments. And we have to work in the organization, and that's what the gender seals are about. And to work with the organization. Why? Because we cannot offer what we do not have. Okay, they're asking me to elaborate on the third here that says avoid reinforcing gender inequalities by ignoring existing unequal gender relations and power disparities between women and men. When we don't know the gender gap that exists, and we even think that it doesn't exist, the things we do unconsciously may be making the gap even worse. And this is what we call indirect discrimination, because it's not expressed in an explicit way in the law, in the procedure, in the bylaw, or in the service itself. But it's there because we don't know the gap. So we cannot ignore the gap. We need to find out through diagnosis and analysis. And I'll make an example, because this can only be understood with examples. In Costa Rica, when we until this project that I'm talking to you about, with rape victims, we have 8 legal medicine units in the country, but they only worked during working hours, from 7:30 to 4 in the morning to 4:30 p.m., Monday through Friday. So whenever there was a person who needed the services of legal medicine, they would have to go to the capital city, to San Jose. For indigenous people that were victims, that would mean even 3 days to get to the capital city, because they would have to walk 2 days out of their reservation to the nearest city and then take a bus for about 8 or 9 hours. For the people who live in the frontiers and in the coast, that would mean 12 or 10 hours. So what did we find out? That's a gender gap. We found out that's a gender gap. Why? Because when we made the analysis, we started to find out, okay, who are the people who need legal medicine services outside of the working period, the regular working hours? Victims of sexual violence and domestic violence. Those were like 93% of the people who needed those kind of services. And when we saw these victims, then we started to disaggregate the information by sex, the data. And we found out that almost 99% of them were women and girls, the ones who were victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. So that was a gender gap in the justice administration system. And we didn't do it consciously. Only when we knew the gap existed, we were able to take measures in order to address the problem. I hope this answers the question. Okay, going now to the last part of my presentation. I was telling you that we should address 2 levels of impact. One is the internal level, working with the organization, and here I repeat that we cannot offer what we don't have internally. We cannot design services that are gender sensitive if the people that work in our institution and the structure of our institution isn't gender sensitive. So that's one of the most important aspects to be addressed. Then and here some of the results that we can have, and all of what I'm going to mention, we have worked in Costa Rica through the loan of the Inter-American Development Bank with the different projects that we developed in the program, all with gender mainstreaming. These are the results. A gender equality policy for the institution, that's basic, because even if we have all the international legal framework, we need domestic framework and we need institutional framework. Also, a strategic plan that integrates gender mainstreaming in the mission, vision, and operational planning and evaluation system. And here, this has been great for gender mainstreaming. I think this is very important because our institution always, decades ago, we have been doing planification. So every office has to make an annual operational planning, and we have to turn it in by October. This, after this strategic plan, where we inserted gender sensitive aspects in the vision of the institution, in its mission, in its goals, we also established as mandatory that every office in the institution, when making their annual plan, had to put gender-sensitive indicators. So if they turn in the planification, the annual planification, to the planification department without these indicators, they won't take it. They'll send it back. And if they don't comply within a short period of days, they'll have disciplinary actions against the chief of that office. But then if you put the gender-sensitive indicators, okay, there's no problem. But then at the end of the year, you didn't do what was on the planification that you put there. We are evaluated 3 times a year on actually implementing this operational planification. And if you do not do everything that you said you would do, the next year your office is penalized with less budget. And nobody wants less budget. So this has been great because we have to turn in the reports by October. So generally in August or September, everybody's crying to the Gender Secretariat and telling us to help them implement their plan in the gender-sensitive indicators. And you know what we say? No, because it's not something that you do from one day to another. You're supposed to do it the whole year round, and they're being sanctioned for that. I wanted to share that with you because that has been one of the greatest ways to mainstream it in the institution. Okay, so also non-discriminating policies for operators regarding HIV, no sexual harassment policies in the workplace. Something that's very important that most employers don't account for is that they have to develop policies to address women workers that are being victims of domestic violence themselves, because our workers come from the same society that has the same cultural sexist patterns in the whole society. So our workers are also in risk of being victims of domestic violence, and the institution has to take account for that and give them protection and give them health services and give them psychological services, and that's a policy we have. Regulations on maternity leave and protection for women operators that are pregnant or breastfeeding, paternity leave, child care services, gender balances at all levels of the staff, and the establishment of a gender equality unit. And if it's already established, it should be strengthened. So it has the right people with the right training, and it has to be at the highest level. Even this, we have worked on it, which is in what part of the organogram it should be. And it should be at the highest level and well paid. That's important. And then some guidelines for working on internal results are to identify strategic partners in the institution at both political and technical level, identify existing gender gaps and gather data, establish a baseline to identify the starting point and record the progress, design and use indicators to monitor and evaluate the impact, involve all, this is basic. You have to involve the programs, and when you hire the consultants, the TORs have to have methodologies that will involve all of the sectors of the institution that will be affected by the project. Have representation of all the areas. What you have to make people feel that the result is coming from them, that it's not being imposed from somebody that's external to the institution. And it has to go through this democratic procedure of validation. So that should be in the TORs. And here a tip that I don't want to miss is that what we used in the program with the loan in the bank was that every time we had to put in licitación, a tender, we would specify in the cartel, do you call it the same? Okay, we would specify that if the consultant had experts in gender, we would assign them extra points. It wouldn't be that we wouldn't consider them because there are insufficient gender experts in the country. But if they did put a gender expert, for example, buildings, because you heard it was, the second part was $22.5 million times 2. So most of the new buildings that we had were built during this program. And I sat down with the architects of my institution and we designed recommendations on infrastructure and gender. And when we had to put out the tender for the buildings, for the constructions, if they put gender experts in their team, they would have extra points in order to be, para que se les diera, that's right, to be assessable. Well, I hope those tips are useful. I'm going to go here. Then there's the external level in the institutions, and this has to do with the services provided by the institution. Here it's important to identify the most sensitive areas that must be addressed in priority because we cannot work everything at the same time. We have to prioritize, and that has to do with identifying where are the most sensitive areas and the larger gaps. And generally it's going to be victims in the criminal system, domestic violence, sexual violence, labor courts, family courts. Also to identify the gender gap in the specific groups of girls and women to whom the services are addressed, and this is what I spoke about before, if they're migrants and refugees, if they're indigenous, and so on. Also, it's important to design, implement, and monitor protocols, to involve the groups of women in the design of the project and its validation, and to design technological instruments to gather the data. These should be this is very important, the systems, the informatic systems, all of that has to do with technology. The programs, and this we worked with Eurosocial, the software should be designed so that the institutions speak among themselves. And so the data will be useful and can be shared by the institutionals according to the legal frameworks, of course. But basically, there should be some information that the different institutions should work together. That is fundamental because generally in our countries, each institution has its own language and has its own way of gathering the data, and that makes institutions work as islands, and that goes against a real public policy that should be systematic and comprehensive and coherent. And then we have the gender analysis, and that's going to be the end. And the gender analysis basically is the brief has you have has gathered a way to explain the gender analysis in a very simple way with lots of examples. And basically what it tells us is that the analysis should be at a macro, at a meso, and at a micro level. And here, just so that you can keep it in mind, and I don't want to confuse you, just to keep it in mind, and you can look for it, there's a methodology that has been built by the World Health Organization, and it's called the um, ecological model to address violence. And it complements this analysis perfectly and in a very simple way. So I strongly recommend you to look for it. And basically it speaks about having parallel actions at an individual level, the family level, the community level, and at the society. So it complements this analysis in a perfect way. At the macro level, what we're looking at are at the national level, law, policy, and decision making. Here where we have to look and find out and gather are if the country has ratified women's rights international conventions. For example, in Latin America, we have the Convention for Belém do Pará. All of the countries have ratified it, and that makes it even more binding. Also in Latin America, we have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and their rulings set the standards for all of the countries. All of this is fundamental for you to know in order to negotiate with the institutions and the governments for them to comply to introducing gender mainstream in everything that they do. Well, here I have examples, but I don't think we have the time, so I'm just going to go on and explain. Well, that's what the macro level has to do with. The meso level looks directly at the institutions, the services, and the infrastructures. The link between laws, policies, and people, enabling them to benefit or be excluded from policy effects. And this is, for example, health services, education, the judiciary, the police, decentralized public services. This looks specifically at the services. And then at the micro level, we look at the individuals and the roles that a patriarchal system has assigned them, those traditional roles, and how this affects people. But then what I'd like to add to this analysis is that when you apply it, you will never find in reality anything that has to do only with one of the levels. Every time that you're going to address a situation, you're going to find circumstances and factors that are according to all of the three levels, because that's reality and it's complex. And you will have to take actions at the macro, meso, and micro level. So that's the way we have to think in public policy, and that's the way we have to think in international cooperation programs. We need to have actions in all of the different levels that are explained here through the gender analysis. And to close, I would like to make mine the words of Rigoberta Menchú, the Guatemalan indigenous woman that is a Nobel Prize winner. And I make mine her words when she says that peace is not only the absence of war. As long as there is poverty, racism, discrimination, and exclusion, we can hardly reach a world in peace. Thank you.